So what I do as a researcher and as a scholar is at the heart of that enterprise are these two questions that animate my work. First, the purpose of my research is to understand how Indian cities develop and why do they develop in the manner they do. How Indian cities develop and why do they develop in that manner. The second thing that animates my research interest is how can we do better than what has been done in the past. If we can learn anything from what has happened from the past and use that to make better plans for a better tomorrow, I think is at the crux of people who are concerned with shaping our cities, where increasingly a large portion of humanity lives. 2 years ago, something like 50%, this is the first time in human history where more than 50% people now live in urban places worldwide. Historically, humans have lived in the countryside. Cities were usually seen as small places, seats of princely empires, administrative centers. But this is the first time. So the question of cities is at the heart of what's happening in the world as we face mighty challenges like climate change, social unrest, religious divides, as we see in many parts of the world. Cities are at the heart of it. So that's doing better than the past is never been more important than it's now. So when I went to graduate school in early 2003, late 2002, I got interested. I was, as many of you know, I used to work here as an architect, and architects usually dabble with planning. So I thought I had some sense. And I went on to do a Master of Architecture in human settlements, sort of like urban design, bridges, architecture, and the way cities get shaped in Leuven, Belgium. And that's where I sort of became interested in the academic discourse around city planning and development. I realized this is a subject that's sort of closer to what I am thinking of finding. And a gradual shift happened. A little interesting side story here. I walked up to one of my senior and more serious professors, and I said, you know what, I am now interested in the global academic discourse around city planning and development. And what do you think I should do? He says, if you spend 8 to 10 hours every day for next 5 to 6 years, you would perhaps begin to get a sense of what is the global discourse around these three terms. So city, what do we mean by planning, and what does development mean? If you spend 8 to 10 hours for next 5 to 6 years. I said, that's a breeze. He said, really? Why do you think it's a breeze? I said, if you work with Shashikant for 12 years, for 14 to 15 hours every day, right? What's 8 to 10 hours? He does not even give a Diwali ki chatti. So I can handle it. And I've spent last 8 to 10 years trying to figure out these three words. And I'll try to distill those three, sort of the concurrent knowledge. So what do we think cities are? So these three are sort of city and planning and development are the founding building blocks for the talk that would follow. So I want you to pay some attention to these three terms. There are many literatures that deal with this. Historians have done some incredible work dealing both with colonial and post-colonial aspects of architecture. Anthropologists have done incredible work thinking about neo-Marxist, neoliberal, and everyday life kind of frameworks. Geographers have spent several generations trying to figure out what a city is. Not much literature out of architecture and urban design and planning, unfortunately. Very little. But then political scientists have tried to figure out how do institutions work, especially at the urban scale. What does region mean? Economists have spent a lot of time figuring out labor markets and so on and so forth. It's a huge literature that comes from various angles. And then it is global, right? So India is a special case. That means reading about Indian context as well as figuring out what's happening in other parts of the world. It's a sizable enterprise. So I tried to distill it, and perhaps this is one part where you would require to pay a little attention. So what's a city? I'll offer 3 pieces of advice or 3 pieces of insights at this point in time. First, cities are relatively new and little understood entities. Humans in their modern form appeared about 200,000 years ago. 200,000 years ago. The first time agriculture happens is about 40,000 years ago, right? 200,000 years, folks have been around walking 2 legs. Agriculture happens 40,000 years ago. First settlements appear about 8,000 years ago. Very new, right? So as humans, we do not really understand them. How many people study cities? Handful. How many planners plan look after the entire Rajasthan state? Not more than 100. 100 planners looking after a state of 7 crores, right? 70 million. That gives you a sense. We know very little about cities. They're so new. Second, cities are complex human creatures. This is sort of the cutting edge knowledge from the field of complexity studies. These are complex human creatures, unlike anything else in the natural world. So natural scientists look for patterns. When they look at an entity, they try to figure out patterns in the natural world. There's nothing like cities. It's entirely a human creature. And that has appeared very recently, right? So those two are important to keep in mind. The third, and this is sort of how people think of cities now in the world of complexity, cities comprise interrelated network of densities. Cities are places where different kinds of densities come together. Densities of people, densities of communities, densities of transportation, densities of commodities, densities of flows, and so on and so forth. That's how they're trying to make sense of what a city is. Planning. Now that's an interesting concept. Commonly, right, and many people in this room and in this country and in the world commonly think of planning as something which is a government-sponsored formal activity, right? That's the state that does the planning. And then there's someone who's an expert, right? And they have a higher degree from a formal institute. And they collect data, and then they analyze that data, and they come up with certain models. It's a formal activity sponsored by state. Now this has been studied to death in the last 50 years. And what they have documented is that planning at the global scale, the kind of planning done as a formal activity by the state, has failed in most places and produced terrible outcomes, right? So there is this tension that, and it's well documented in scholarly literature in different parts of the world. Now there is an emergent view of planning, and this is important. That planning is now sort of seen more broadly as purposeful efforts, where people are with an intention, with certain aim in their mind, are trying to anticipate, are trying to figure out and prepare for an uncertain future. If there's one thing that's uncertain, is our future. We do not really know what tomorrow will bring. And that condition has stayed with human beings since our inception on this world. We have never known what happens tomorrow. And all of us prepare for it in different ways. So, in that sense, planning is sort of, now we think of planning, and scientists who sort of work around human behavior, behavioral patterns, cognitive thinking, now realize planning is a hardwired human trait. Everyone makes plans. People make plans for retirements, people make plans for their vacation, people make plans for how they would spend, about household formation, about marriage, and so on and so forth. Everyone makes plans. We do not think of those as plans because we think of planning as a formal activity. There would be more on this going forward. But that's sort of the cutting edge ideas about what planning as an activity is.